Hi, everyone. I'm sure you've all heard of the recent collaborative efforts between Google and Apple in the release of the Exposure Notification API last week in their efforts to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. So we want to talk about what that is. What is the Exposure Notification API? So it's essentially, it's not an app or software. It's a framework that will allow public health agencies to then build out their own apps for consumers to download to fight and limit the spread of COVID-19. How does it work? The API allows for the smartphones to log any sort of Bluetooth connections with other smartphones, particularly across different brands. So an iPhone owner could then, running the app, would log any sort of encounters with all smartphones, including Android users. And it'll store that encounter locally on the smartphones or within the app for a rolling 14 days. So that information isn't getting sent to any public health agencies. It's stored locally. And if someone that you've encountered over the past 14 days that's logged onto the app tests positive for COVID-19, that person can then voluntarily input that information into the app. Once that person inputs that information, an exposure notification is then sent out to everyone who has encountered that smartphone. So the thought process being is if I have the app running and I've encountered someone who later tests positive for COVID-19, and that person then inputs that information, I will be notified that I was potentially exposed to someone who's tested positive for COVID-19. From there, I can personally then adjust my behavior and act accordingly to limit the spread of COVID-19 and flatten the curve. So that's basically how it works. The question is, will it have any sort of effectiveness in fighting this virus? Unfortunately, I say no, for a few key reasons. One, the main reason being is that for something like this to work, it'll require the vast majority of smartphone owners to download and use the app. Secondly, the approach that is being taken is being handled by multiple public health agencies across the country, rather than a singular agency that can then develop an app for all US consumers. Instead, today, we have multiple states approaching it individually and trying to build out their own apps, which will dilute the effectiveness of the API, especially when we talk about reopening the country and resuming things like travel, vacationing, crossing state borders, etc. None of those will be tracked if the apps are developed state by state. Thirdly, I think there's going to be issues of trust, regardless of how anonymous the information is delivered and how the information is stored. There will always be a contingent of consumers that are hesitant to allow that sort of tracking and that would voluntarily input their health information into this sort of app. So those are the reasons why I think it will ultimately fail. There are actions that we can take to help promote it and help the effectiveness of it. One, I think the first step would have to come from the top, and it would require a single agency that can develop a single app for all US consumers. It would be much more simpler for US consumers if there's just one app that they have to go to and that can trace the movements and log movements of consumers across the country rather than a state-by-state basis. Secondly, I think that there are issues with incentives. Beyond the social incentives of limiting the spread of COVID-19 and keeping people safe, and economic incentives also need to be communicated, such as incentives to reopen the economy, get people back to work. Keeping people at work and limiting the impact of any sort of additional waves of COVID-19. Beyond those sort of social incentives, though, personal incentives may also need to be required to get individual consumers on board. Perhaps discounts, promotional materials, or even simply free stuff given out to people who download and use the app actively could incentivize enough users to use it to reach that critical mass that's needed in order for this sort of API to have any sort of effectiveness. Beyond those actions, though, I ultimately think that the exposure notification API will have a very limited impact on reducing the spread of COVID-19. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please reach out to your Mintel account manager.